Thank you for joining us this morning through our panel on embracing open source in risk-adverse organizations. I'm Jamie Jones. I lead our field architecture team here at GitHub. Really happy to be sort of moderating or trying to moderate this wonderful panel we have for us today. As you've heard throughout the last 2 days, open source and its value in not only the community and security, but on organizations is something that's constantly growing. One of my roles here at GitHub is to help organizations, risk-adverse and otherwise, embrace and have success with open source. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I brought together a panel of representatives from risk-adverse is probably the best way to describe it. Organizations who are also sort of embarking on or deeply down this open source journey. I really want to have an opportunity for them to share their own stories, their experiences, their successes, and maybe some of the pitfalls they've had along the way of how they've been able to sort of drive open source within their organizations. Real quick, even if we can see you beyond these bright lights, by a show of hands, are there those who work in risk-adverse organizations, heavy security, compliance, regulation, and are maybe still trying to do open source? Wonderful. So this is
cool.
You are my people.
Yes.
This is super good. So I want to give my panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves and their organizations. John Mark.
Hi, I'm John Mark Walker. I run the open source program office at CapitalOne. You may know me from such hits as VA Linux and SourceForge. Sorry, for the kids out there, SourceForge was GitHub before GitHub. Just, all right. And then Hyperic and Groundwork, and more recently Gluster and Red Hat. I spent the last 20 years working in open source communities, being a community manager or community facilitator, developer relations. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I started asking myself the question, I feel like I'm good at what I do, but the central question is, how much value does what I do actually add to the organization for which I work? How does it translate into dollars and cents? And so as I started thinking about that, I started thinking about why is it that technology vendors are ever present in all these open source communities? And if we agree that so much innovation happens in these open source spaces, why is it that it's so heavy with software vendors and software makers and not some of these larger traditional enterprises? And so that's kind of began the journey towards where I am now at CapitalOne, because I thought, it'd be a really good chance to dive in and figure out, how is open source being used within CapitalOne and companies like it, and how can we make the participation rate greater, and how can we add value and get value, because it's has to be a symbiotic relationship. But how do we unlock these things and sort of work within this risk-averse environment? Or the title of the panel is Embracing Open Source. We've embraced open source, so now what?
Tosha.
Thank you. I'm Tosha Ellison, the Director of Member Success at FINOS. And I'll start first with what FINOS is. We're the FinTech Open Source Foundation. So we're an independent, nonprofit 501c6. And really our aim is to get financial services institutions, so large banks, hedge funds, asset managers, to do more with open source. So they tend to be very large consumers of open source, but not great on the contribution side. And so really, that's why we exist. We have many large banks as our members. We have CapitalOne, Citibank, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, all the big players, some smaller ones as well. And then we have tech companies, GitHub, Red Hat, and financial services-focused tech companies, IHS Markit, TradeWeb, Refinitiv, and then service companies, some smaller fintechs. GreenKey does some interesting stuff with voice. Wipro, big organization incumbent in a lot of the financial services institutions. So really, we bring them all together to help them figure out how to collaborate and innovate using open source. And the way we do that is twofold, really. One, it's for those companies who don't have policies or processes to be able to contribute. We work with them to kind of move them along the scale so that they can actually engage. And then we also host a number of projects within the foundation where these banks and technology companies can come together to collaborate on open source software and standards. And so the way I got into FINOS was my career has always been in financial services and technology. I started in a Silicon Valley startup just down the peninsula, developing risk management software for banks. I then went to work for a bank, worked there at Credit Suisse for about 14 years in technology and in front office in electronic trading. And one of the things that's very remarkable is that it's a lot of the same software built again and again and again, often within the same institution, and certainly across the street, so across the banks. How many trade blotters do you really need? So that led us, a few of us internally, to think about, well, what can we do to help these banks mutualize the software, to take out some of that duplicative spend, to then spend more time on the interesting stuff? And so we co-founded a startup funded by Credit Suisse, which was a little bit harder than we had hoped, and then did some consulting, and then came to FINOS. And so it's really, the transition has been within the financial services and seeing where you can take, those opportunities to collaborate. And, we truly believe that open source is the way forward for financial services. Very risk-averse institutions.
Gil.
Hi, I'm Gil Yahuda. I run the open source program at Verizon Media. And I'll tell you the short story. Many years ago, I was an enterprise architect at Fidelity Investments. And at the time when open source came up, I was vocally opposed to running an open source program and doing anything with open source. I thought it was a horrible idea, and people knew that I thought it was a horrible idea. I was the person on the other side of that conversation. And through self-reflection, education, personal involvement, I switched. So a few years later, I found myself running the open source program office at Yahoo. And I've been at Yahoo for almost 10 years now, running the open source program there. Yahoo was acquired by Verizon, merged with AOL. So I'm running the open source program at Yahoo and AOL in a division of Verizon called Verizon Media. So where I started in this very risk-averse financial services, open source is bad, flipped to a open source is awesome. Let's give away Hadoop and see what happens. Let's create big data as an ecosystem and see what we can do with it, right? So this sort of complete opposite to now at the nexus between a division of Verizon, which is an internet media company and has a very positive sentiment towards open source, in an organization that's traditional and risk-averse and not as much into, hey, let's do open source, right? So I'm watching that game play out again.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us. Hopefully we can sort of build on your backgrounds and the things you're doing today at your businesses or with the groups you're supporting to sort of pull together how your organizations are able to sort of handle open source and succeed in it today. So on that same topic, one of the things we've heard multiple times today, I heard Erica B. mention it today during the keynote, applications built today, started right now, are comprised of upwards of 90% open source software. This isn't the case even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So the way applications are built and designed is changing. How is this actually changing the way your organizations are building software? Are they embracing open source the same way, different ways? What's been the actual results you've seen internally?
We've been pretty forward-looking when it comes to how we use open source software and how we utilize it. And we embraced it, I think, over 5 years ago when our company CIO stood up and said, we're an open source first organization. So I would say it's changed substantially how we assemble software, how we distribute it internally within the company. And also, it kind of led the way to us being a public cloud embracer. Especially for, compared to other people in our industry. So I would say substantially.
I think, you're in an organization who's, when we think about it, much further along on the maturity scale of open source than some of the other ones that we deal with. And so we see quite a variety. There are people who aren't even fully tracking their consumption of open source yet, which obviously has risks that have to be addressed. And so, that's an issue. And then maybe have done a single contribution, but can't contribute back bug fixes to, standards pieces of software. So, I think there definitely is a change, even in the last 10, 5 years in being more accepting of that contribution. But it takes a long time to get from, right, we probably have to do it. And not everybody is still there yet, by the way. You still talk to some people in big financial institutions and they say open source? No, we're good. We build all our stuff. We're fine. We're used to building it. My trader right there, he's telling me what he wants. I'm just going to take care of it this way. So there is a cultural shift that has to change. And I think that's starting to happen. And it just takes a lot of pushing and pushing and pushing across, an organization that has 50,000 people or 20,000 people or 25,000 technologists, let alone the rest of the stuff. And so, we do see that movement, but a lot of it has to be that cultural shift, and that, and finding some simple or specific opportunities to make a few things happen, and then build on that and build on that. So it's getting there, but it's not fast.
Yeah.
Where we see it, at least where I see it in my world, is that within the organization there are different behaviors in different pockets. Because one of the things that you find common in risk-averse organizations and in financial services organizations in particular is that they're very complex, such that you might have people who are in technology but they're building products. Other people who are in technology, but they're building platforms. And the way you build platforms is different than, or support platforms, is different than the way you build products. There are other people in technology, but they're in the CIO organization, and they're providing products and services internally exclusively. So the adoption of open source, whether it be bringing code from the outside or using an open source vendor versus a traditional software licensed vendor, or using open source methodology to build something, might differ in different parts of the company. So in some parts of the company, you say, well, we're really enlightened, and this will save us money, we can do it. And in other parts of the company, they'll say, no way, we're building every line of code on our own because this is a product that we can't afford to take the risk of open source, whatever that risk happens to therefore be.
And if I may interject here, a lot of what drives that culture change and change going forward is the day two conversation. Okay, we built this thing, now what? How do we maintain it going forward? Or as my manager likes to say, open source is free as in puppy, right? Because now you're responsible for caring for this thing and making sure that it's well-fed and well-managed and all this stuff. So a lot of it that changes the thinking is it's not just can you build this thing, but can you build it? Can you establish the governance around this internal project? And work with all the different stakeholders and bring them together and do it in a way that doesn't increase risk, establishes value.
To an acceptable level.
Exactly, and that's a good point to bring up.
I would also add that not everything needs to be open sourced. There's 5,000 applications in a typical bank, between 3 and 7, let's say. They don't all need to be fully open sourced. They might all use open source software, but there are degrees. And so there's enough opportunity in the stuff that doesn't hold your secret sauce to be identifying opportunities. I mean, we think one of those places has to be in meeting regulatory requirements. Not so much for you, but definitely, it's all about transparency. You have to meet common standards. You're trying to interpret thousands of pages of, documentation, and surely that's done better together. Yes. And there's not a lot of competitive advantage. Although I will tell you that one time, several years ago, we were having a conversation, a couple of big banks. There's a piece of incumbent vendor software that they both wanted to, well, somebody had a proprietary inbuilt system, another one using a vendor tool that they weren't super happy with. And so we thought, all right, this is a good matchmaking opportunity. Let's take your really good proprietary tool, see how we can, get you to use that instead. And the guy said, well, but compliance is a competitive advantage for us. Why would we share this software? And my colleague and I just sort of thought, well, okay, is that really the place where you want your competitive advantage to be? And is that really right for the market? And we had many, many, many conversations, and eventually he did agree that actually it made sense to collaborate. But it's interesting, and you have to have a lot of these conversations, like you were saying, across the organization. Yes. to get people to understand what the value really can be.
What's super interesting there, so one of the things we talk about at GitHub a lot is sort of customer obsession and how we want to drive the best outcomes and the best successes for our customers. thinking that we'll do that by compliance being a competitive advantage, right, is sort of the antithesis of that. So, definitely seeing and driving open source that way is definitely, I think, helps out everyone, not just developers and engineers, but our customers in general. I wanted to dig in a little bit on, so John Mark, you made a great comment that at CapitalOne a couple years ago, it came down from your CIO, that you are a tech-first company, you're an open source first company. That's one way to embrace open source, right, when it comes from the top, but that's not the only way to embrace open source.
Sure.
Tosha, I'd love to hear from you as you have sort of insight into what multiple banks and multiple organizations are doing. What are some of the different ways you've seen, maybe more from a bottom-up approach, that has helped in driving some of the open source change throughout the years? And then everyone can feel free to follow up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually going to talk about a specific inner sourcing project, which then kind of prompted a bigger move towards open source and actually putting in a board. There's this big bank in Europe refers to this as a skunkworks project. There's a team who is doing a lot of development for their web applications, and internal and external, and they were doing a lot of the same stuff again and again and again, and they thought, all right, surely there's got to be a way to reuse some of this code. And other teams would be coming to them to say, for some support, and they're having to redevelop the same stuff. So they took it upon themselves, a team of 3, to try and just do more on automation and tooling, to make it easier when they were answering these questions for these different teams who needed, new tools or services. And that kind of built, and then all of a sudden, lots of people were wanting to reuse their tools. And it was making the commonly needed data more accessible. It was making sure that all of your brand guidelines and compliance was kind of built in. It was, giving you prefabbed pages, all sorts of things or tools, all sorts of things that make sense. And so this small group of 3 was then a bit overwhelmed with the requests coming in, and they said, well, hey, why don't you help out? You can build some tools too. And 2.5 years later, it's a really big success story for them. They've saved, they say, 12 million euros, which is a sizable amount of change on reuse and on time, because now they can produce something in a day as opposed to a month or several months. And I think what that let them be able to do is say, hey, check this out. This is our use case. What else can we do? And they did a big open source project and then realized that they weren't actually fully prepared to do a big open source project, that they didn't really know how to build a community, that they didn't know how to get all of the people involved in order to further the product. And maybe they hadn't covered off internally how everyone is going to work. But that's then what starts the conversation. So now they're putting together a full open source office. They have all of the right people involved. They're looking at more opportunities. They're making sure that they can collaborate externally, in GitHub repos. And so, I think there are lots of different approaches. And I think you might have some examples of some other, ways that this can happen too. But, certainly that's. I think that was a big success.
So proving out the ROI on something safer internally that they could then use to sort of segue into the open source conversation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I see. Typically the pattern is bottom up. In some cases, it's top down. It's very rarely starting from the middle. Right? Middle management rarely is going to be the push. But middle management is an important part. Usually where the open source program offices reside is somewhere in middle management. And yet middle management isn't always the friendliest part of where open source is in a company.
I feel attacked.
No, I mean, we're not the we're not the CTOs.
I'm joking.
Right? And we're not the line developers. And yet it's an enlightened CTO or an enlightened CIO who will say, yeah, open source is a good thing. I read about it somewhere. We should do it, and then sort of leave it there. Right? And then developers come in and say, well, of course we have to do open source. After all, I have a career to manage, and I'm not going to rewrite somebody else's code. I mean, I need to be effective, right? And there's somebody in the middle is saying, oh, I have a problem with this. Like, I have a problem with somebody contributing to my repo that I don't control their time. I have a problem with incurring risk for somebody else's project, and I don't really know what the SLA on fixing it is, or whatever the risk is. And what I find from the perspective of the open source program office or of the advocate within the risk-averse organization, of whatever it is in your particular case, is that you have to have the agility to have one of 3 conversations. One conversation is one about fear. which is the compliance conversation. And it's the who patches this and how is it secured and what are the license compliance issues that typically come up, right? It's the fear conversation. The other conversation is sort of the opposite. It's the love conversation. How do we enable engineers to be effective, right? And how do we have somebody who's not only a hero in their group, but a hero within the company through inner source, or a hero in everyone's company through open source? Like, how do foster that love? And the third is a conversation about money. Like, are we saving money? Are we deferring costs? And in some cases, are we able to make money by giving something to the open source community that leads them into some sort of economic system that we have, like some of the larger companies, tech companies do? Now, you can't have the love conversation with somebody who wants to have the fear one with you. And you can't have a fear conversation with somebody who wants the money conversation with you. You got to be able to figure out who are you talking to. And are you talking to somebody who is begging for you to assure them that the fear that they have is going to be handled by a good program? Or are you talking to somebody who really wants to make sure that you understand that there's something in it for them and have that love conversation, or indeed the money? And if you can get that right, then from the middle management vantage point, which is the weakest point to have, you can speak up, speak down, speak across,
right,
and be effective.
Yeah, I have the scars from having the love conversation with people who really just want to talk about ROI and money. So yes, I can speak to that one very, very clearly. I loved your point about how, Tosha's point about how inner source can be kind of a open source in a non-scary way for people who think open source is super scary, because it does take a lot of things off the table that can stymie an open source conversation. So let's say, for example, we'll talk about license compliance. We'll talk about vulnerabilities. We'll talk about all the things that people bring up when they say, oh my God, all this open source stuff. So inner source is a great way to kind of push those off to the side and really focus on the things that deliver real value. And so, I look at my team's role as kind of like, how do we provide the air cover and deal with all those problems around risk management and internal audit and all that stuff so that you, the developer, don't have to? How do we automate the processes? How do we get that going? But to the point around, inner source can be a great kind of halfway step or first step, I absolutely agree. And that's something that we've run things like hackathons and sort of enablement sessions with other engineers to sort of build this broad base of support we'll need to go further. And so if you're looking for a way to accumulate the stakeholders that you need to drive initiatives forward, if you're looking for ways to get other executives involved so you can build, again, the momentum that you need, inner source activities are a great way to do that, as long as you have support from the right people who can get involved and push you forward.
One of the things that as I'm out talking to users all throughout the world, honestly, and I hate to say open source at companies is a progressive statement at this point because, as you're showing here, it's definitely taking hold, but there's still pockets all throughout where open source is still a scary or a dirty word. Even in companies that are embracing open source and doing really well with open source, there's still pockets within that. Gil, you spoke really well on how even within Verizon and the many pieces of Verizon, there's pieces that are areas that are much more forward-leaning with open source and areas that are not. What do you tell, as a developer, as an engineer, right, who may be unfortunately stuck in a pocket of the organization that's less forward-leaning with open source, even with an OSPO, even with other portions of the org that are embracing open source? What's your advice to that engineer, right, who needs top cover and can't find it? Or how do they start the conversation with their middle management, right, to get more access and capabilities for open source?
So I would advise the engineer to ask good questions and to be open to the answers. I'll tell you an inner source story that kind of I shared with you just before we got on here.
When you bring that up, I was like, come on.
It's a good story.
I thought I teed you up for that.
So I will swing at that. It's a good story because it taught me to really think about risk differently. So the situation that we had is we had a product group that needed a technology. And we had a platform group that built this technology. And I asked them, why did you build it? And they said, well, we looked at open source and we found that what was available wasn't good enough, and we had to build something better. And I asked them, well, did you contribute it back? And they said, well, no, because it was a different architecture. It wouldn't have worked to contribute back. We really had to build this on our own. Okay, fine. I went to the product group. Why don't you want to use that? They built this for you. And they said, it's too risky. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, that group can be defunded, right? Those people can leave. In fact, one of the people, like the main engineer, I know he wants to leave because he interviewed with our group, and he's interviewing elsewhere. And if we use this technology that they built for us, we'll be stuck if they get defunded or if they blow up. So we would much rather use an open source technology because at least it'll work. Now, as it turns out, the open source technology would have cost them a lot more money to use in terms of the number of servers they needed to run. So they were willing to spend more money on an open source technology because in their world, it was less risky than using the internally built technology. I went to the group that built the technology and I said, great, what if you open source that and turned that into an open source technology and proved that it actually was really valuable? And we did, and it's open source. It's called Apache Pulsar. So Pulsar is a pub/sub message subscription technology that is similar to Kafka, but it has different modality in terms of how it handles scalability on message, number of message topics versus number of messages, right? So it was built by a team at Yahoo who, at first, we were going to can the project. We open sourced it first to abate risk because in that environment, the risk of internal code was greater than open source. Now, the way we were able to get to that conclusion, a conclusion that benefits all of you in case you want to use Apache Kafka, right, or Apache Pulsar, the way we got there is we asked good questions, like, why aren't you using this? What is the risk? What are you concerned about? Why do you want to use open source? Is it because it's cool, or because there's a legitimate risk? Like this team might not be there for you next year, right? So for the engineer who's getting pushback, sometimes the pushback is legitimate. A risk-averse company isn't risk-averse because they're wrong. They're risk-averse because that's what they are. So in that environment, ask the questions. What are the risks? And then understand the answers. And then with those answers, figure out a way to abate the risks so that you can find success. And that's what I would do.
I think, so following up on that comment, when I think about how engineers work together in risk-averse environments, the first piece of advice I would give you is really develop your empathy skills. Because people who work in risk management and internal audit and legal and finance, they're not bad, they're not evil people. They have jobs to do. And I think it works really better if you can kind of understand where they're coming from and how you can actually work with them going forward. We have several groups that do risk management, who do internal audit, and I've gotten to know them very, very well over the last few months. And I've thought about, it's really great that we have these resources because we can actually, one of our superpowers is that because we have to work within these environments, we actually are finely honed in ways that, say, technology companies are not. And we're able to produce these kind of risk management strategies about, okay, well, I know the risk of that, but what about the risk of not doing something? What's the risk of not participating? What's the risk of not being influencers in this vast wealth of innovation that's happening in these open source communities? What does that do to your hiring pipeline? All the different ways that you can think of when you measure risk. And so my advice to you engineers is learn how to work with these people. Learn what drives them and why they're there and the value that they're adding to your organization. Because I think that if you start having those conversations, you're going to learn a lot about how your companies work respectively and figure out how to work within those environments.
Yeah, I think, so you're better to speak to this than I am, but some of the things that we've seen be successful are finding specific use cases as well, so that it's not this amorphous, well, I want to do open source, and where legal is clearly going to say, okay, well, and risk and compliance, what does that mean specifically? And so sometimes, finding a use case where you can get some senior buy-in, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a big thing, and where it's something that isn't necessarily competitive, where you can see that there's an ROI from collaboration. So we have a project around cloud service certification. Banks are all going to the cloud. They're a little bit slow. They're all going to need to be multi-cloud. They all have to certify More or less the same, because there are regulations that say you have to meet it this way. Of course, there are regulations from 15 different regulators, but they're all pretty much regulated across the board. So why not do that together? And so if you can take that kind of case, and look, it's not super risky, and we have a little bit of time to develop it, and you can see everything. If you can take a specific use case and walk through, what are the real risks? What are the perceived risks? Are we going to be sharing data? Well, no. All right. Well, that makes it an easier one to start with. Are we? Is there IP that's going to well, this is how we address this, and then there are all these licenses, and we know which ones we're going to use, and we know how we're going to collaborate, and we know how we're going to get around antitrust, not get around, appropriately deal with antitrust concerns.
Rewind the tape. Yeah. Mark that. Yeah.
On the advice of
everything's
counsel,
minuted. It's all good. And so, find one of those and take that to your manager and take that to the next manager, and you be persistent too.
100%. I mean, in fact, I would take one of those examples. So one of the things you just said reminded me of a conversation I recently had with somebody who said, "Oh, we can't approve this particular. We can't open up these repos because there might be customer data in them, right?" And my question that I shot back sort of immediately and a little perhaps too directly was what? Wait. You really think there could be customer data? If that's the case, we have a huge problem here. Find out who those developers are, line them against the wall, right? And let's see if any of them put customer data in that repo, and let's have everything locked and loaded, because if they do, right? And it was let's turn this. The fact that you're even able to raise this risk. Yeah. Let's lean really in on that and say, what the hell are people putting customer data in code repositories? Do they not understand that is a huge file? And you think that it's acceptable to have that if the repo is private? That's the solution?
Yeah.
Oh, if we keep it private, then we're okay. No, that's even greater risk. In fact, we should open this up and make sure that it isn't the case. Because and then they say, oh, no, we're sure that no one would ever put any customer data. Oh, well, if you're sure, then why did you bring it up? Because I was about to line up a whole bunch of developers against the wall and have a really serious dramatic thing over here, and it's that kind of make sure that if there really is risk to abate, honor that all the way. And if there isn't, and somebody's just throwing risk at you, then you're speaking to the wrong person, right? And find the right person to speak to.
Yeah.
On that same topic, right? So one of the things you mentioned, I think it was you, John Mark, earlier, we often talk in the open source community, in mailing lists and websites and Medium articles and everywhere else, right? About day zero of open source. I want to open source a thing. I'm open sourcing a thing. I'm starting an OSPO.
Yes.
I worry we don't talk enough about day two of open source. And my favorite quote on this topic is, when people stop being nice and start getting real. As preparation for this, did you know that The Real World is on season 33 right now? MTV may not show music anymore, but they still show The Real World, which is impressive. But
now I'm really feeling old.
Yeah, well, I didn't have to date when you watch The Real World. But on this same topic, open source is great on day zero. You've shared information. But I often talk to organizations who are well, that worked until we found out our competitor forked our repo and they're now selling it as a product. Or marketing came to me yesterday and said, have you seen the thing that people are saying on this GitHub website about our company? And how we haven't updated this thing forever and how that means we're X, Y, Z? These are real challenges that we have to prepare for. And it's not even just getting the first open source, but how do you deal with it after it's out there? Is there, from whether it be legal, whether it be marketing, whether it just be life, I'd love to talk a little bit about what that looks like sort of after day one.
Because, this is where I get to tout and laud some of our prior accomplishments, because about a little over 3 years ago, we released our first major open source project. It's called Hygeia. It's a DevOps dashboard. And speaking about the risk management conversation we just had, you can see a lot of our views around risk management kind of baked into this piece of software. But we released that 3 years ago, and I think if you had asked the people at the time if they really understood how this would work on day two, after we have the initial kumbaya, join us now and share the software, what happens afterwards, I'm not sure they could have given a good answer. But now that we've had 3 years of history developing that and doing it in a very open and transparent way and following all the good governance policies of open source management, I feel that it's been a learning experience for all the engineers that have been involved, and has allowed us to, as an OSPO, to kind of be instructive and enabling of other engineers who want to follow down that path. So, if you have the sort of open source release like a Hygeia, it allows you to kind of build that internal, muscle so that you can learn to work within that environment. It's a great thing. And we followed that up more recently with Cloud Custodian. And it's sort of the same thing. Now that we've kind of learned the lessons from that first one, we can apply them more easily and efficiently as we go forward. And I'm actually really proud of how we've been able to work with both of those projects in a very open source friendly way, and I think in a way that surprised a lot of people. And to your point, all the bad things that people bring up in terms of fear of open source, none of those things happened. I'm sure that we have competitors today using both of those tools or parts of them.
And collaborating with competitor banks on some of those tools.
Maybe. So, but it doesn't come up as far as, well, does this give away our competitive advantage? And I attribute that to the fact that we've done our homework and we've sort of done it in a piecemeal fashion leading up to this point where we can say, yes, this adds real value, and we can go about it in a risk-managed way that doesn't, open up this door and can actually give real value to us and to the greater community at large. So.
Yeah, I think we have obviously, we're all about collaboration amongst competitors, so it happens. It happens in our foundation. It happens on GitHub and the repos. But I do think that, the bad things do happen, and it's going to go wrong, and somebody's going to, do something that somebody else doesn't like, and that happens internally, it's going to happen externally, and you just have to work through it. And so partly when you open source something, you have to make sure that you're aware that those things happen. You have to protect yourself as much as you can. Sometimes you're not going to win, and is it worth it anyway? So there's certainly an evaluation process. And then just move through it. And hopefully it doesn't involve lawyers, and if it does, well, it does, but that,
lawyers can be friendly too.
That's 1 out of maybe 20 times. And so, the fear of that, I don't think should be enough to hold people back, but an awareness that, shit happens is, you have to have it and be prepared for it.
We find rare things happen rarely. That's a tautology. But when you do things a lot, the rare things happen because you're doing things a lot, right? So something that's very obscure, like very rarely will we find ourselves checking in a key, or a hash or something into a repository that gets open sourced. But when you do it 50 times a year, launch 50 new open source projects a year, well, okay, like 1 in 50. Okay, that's once a year, and then that's a really bad day, You gain a lot of respect for the risk aversion that your company had. You gain a lot of, you actually get a little bit of ammunition. You get to go back to your bosses and say, listen, we had a really bad day. We made a mistake. We got on Hacker News, or we got, something happened, and that it wasn't the outcome we wanted, but what we need is really to improve our processes, maybe hire somebody, that we could, handle this part of the process that we had overlooked and assumed that everything would go well. So bad things will happen. Risk-averse companies are risk-averse because they recognize that. Their aversion is a message to you saying, if you come back from the conference saying, I got stickers, I got T-shirts, this was really cool, I had a great time, that message isn't going to translate into, oh, awesome, you can now do everything you want because you have stickers, But you have to come to them with a strong, I understand the risk, I understand the fear, I understand the love, I understand how to get there, and I'm working with people with an organization in my industry, whether it's FINOS or comparable ones in other industries. I'm working with people who know what they're doing and recognize and respect this, and then we can staff up, put the processes in place, learn from what other open source programs do, and actually succeed, because the risk of not doing something is as great as the risk of doing something, and the doing something is not just day one, but is creating the organizational muscle to succeed in open source.
Yeah.
Well put.
Gil, putting you on the spot then for a second, what's the worst, without naming names or projects or where in your career, what's the worst sort of open source outcome? Is it checking in keys? Is it, is it because of these relationships you had previously that you're able to get past this event, this problem? Or was it something, or you had to phone a friend that was like, okay, I need this one out?
Yeah. We had one of those way back earlier in my career. We had that shouldn't have been out there. We had a interesting conversation on an online site about the quality of the code that was checked in somewhere, and we turned that around and said, hey, this is what they're saying, and you know what, they're right. This is, and you know what? It's actually good that they're saying that, because it gives us a moment to ask ourselves, well, how did we get there, and why is it there? And yeah, it was embarrassing and uncomfortable, but we matured from it. So yeah, we had those.
Yep.
I don't want to spill all the beans
Sure.
on the details, but we've been doing open source for a while, at least on the progressive.
Yep.
Open source friendly part of the company, which is why the more risk-averse part of the company is really holding us to a higher standard, because they don't want to have those things happen to them.
I like it's you need the right mindset, not just of your team, but of management and leadership, right? But in turn, these truly are opportunities, right? It's maybe we don't look inward enough to say, is my code of highest quality? Are we actually doing enough to make sure customer data or PII isn't getting checked in, right? The problem isn't the open source, sometimes it's us, and that's a hard problem, that's a hard feeling to have, but it's a real thought to have.
One thing about working in a risk-averse environment, it challenges the notion that source code is the highest thing of value, which I think we kind of get that wrong sometimes. But working in an environment like this teaches us that the means to collaboration, the governance, all the things that are not necessarily highly valued in engineering organizations turn out to be actually really super valuable. And because we work in the environments we do, we're forced to have a more holistic view of what a project looks like and what project governance looks like. And source code is obviously valuable. If it weren't for source code, we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't have jobs. But there's a whole lot else around that takes you from source code to things of value that you can deliver.
Real quick, as we're almost out of time, give everyone a chance to sort of give one parting shot, whether it's a suggestion, a tip. Oh, that was okay. Would you like to do another one or not? But no, just one final tip or thought you want to leave with sort of the audience.
Well, I want people to know that financial services is actually embracing open source, and there are all sorts of reasons why. Compressed margins and continued spend on reg means they're going to have to do things differently. The talent that they used to get, they're not getting anymore, and so we're already seeing a shift. And so, people who are into open source and want to build open source technology should not shy away from the financial services industry. Risk averse though they may be.
I'm going to be very pragmatic and say my final message, my parting message is I'm hiring. And if you guys are really into this conversation, you love GitHub, you want to work in an exciting organization and help with, managing risk, contact me, because I'd love to talk to you.
We're hiring too. Sorry.
Like any good open source conversation, this will continue on the internet. Thank you all for your time today, and thank you for attending Universe.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.